Mika, why are you late again? Oh, that makes me so mad.
I'm sorry. It's just really hard to get up in the morning, and you always want me to come so early, and
You just don't care about me at all.
that's what I do. But now I feel really bad.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to make you feel bad. It's just...
You don't. I don't need to do this. I'm just gonna go home.
Oh no, I've done it again. I'm sorry, Mika. Look, okay, I think we need to work on our communication skills, okay? I didn't mean to commit emotional violence upon you.
I didn't want to make you feel bad either. I care about you.
Oh, well, maybe today's book is gonna give us the simple tool that's gonna make no one ever feel any pain ever again. Should we talk about it?
Yeah,
Okay.
let's do that.
All right, awesome. Welcome to Thriving Between the Lines, the podcast that examines personal development books through the lens of intersectionality, making self-help content more accessible and relatable. I am life coach and person making everything about race, Leslie Crude Up Villa Garcia,
And I'm Mika, a reanimated corpse.
and together we're not just reading between the lines,
We're thriving between the lines.
Alrighty, right. So today, as usual, we are recording from Mianjin, or Brisbane, land of the Yagara and Turrbal people, where sovereignty has never been ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So, reanimated corpse, you say? Explain
Well,
yourself.
It's what it feels like.
What's going on?
Just having health flare up with the chronic conditions.
Which flavor of flare-up is presenting itself today?
Fibro, chronic fatigue typeness. So I'm not sleeping so well when the pain hits, and then I just been fatigued anyway, and
Yeah, that fatigue. I'm in my luteal phase of my menstrual cycle, so my PMDD goblins are like, no, Leslie, you don't need to be awake ever. Come and join us in the fatigue house.
I do not miss the
The menstruation.
that's it. The one that I am so traumatized by, I have forgotten what it's called.
So your whole experience of your menstrual history was just completely blacked out.
Basically.
Congratulations. I'm sorry for opening that box of tampons again. Anyway, chronic conditions are hard. And you know what else is hard? Communication.
Oh, that's not what I was going to say, but yes.
And what book are we talking about today, Mika?
Non-Violent Communication by Marshall B. Rosenberg, PhD.
Oh, pretty hot dude. Awesome. Now, as a lot of our listeners already know, I have a master's degree in applied linguistics, and communication is one of the things that I am really fascinated by. Just the way people communicate with each other and how that reverberates not just in interpersonal relationships, but throughout society. So, on this podcast, a lot of the books we talk about, we kind of tear them apart. It's not really our primary aim. It just kind of happens that way. So, one might look at this and go, nonviolent communication? What's wrong with that? Like, how can you have anything bad to say about nonviolent communication?
To be honest, I'm not that opposed to the actual application when done right and from a solid psychological foundation.
Yeah.
I'm on board with. I use it in everyday communication. So I agree with the general method.
Uh-huh.
But the way he has presented it feels uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think this is the perfect book for this podcast. Because it's there are really useful things in this book. The whole concept of nonviolent communication is leaned upon very heavily in a lot of different modalities, a lot of different therapeutic practices, and things like that, in a way that most of the time I really appreciate. However, and here's Leslie's big but again, but when you look at the source material for this information, it highlights the need to look at these things with more scrutiny to make sure that how we are applying them isn't causing damage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm going to start just by reading the back cover of the book. Okay, because I think this gives us a really good overview about what this whole jam is. So violence communication versus nonviolent communication, right?
Yep.
What is violent communication? If violent means acting in ways that result in hurt or harm, then much of how we communicate, judging others, bullying, having racial bias, blaming, finger-pointing, discriminating, speaking without listening, criticizing others or ourselves, name-calling, reacting when angry, using political rhetoric, being defensive, or judging who's good or bad, or what's right or wrong with people, could indeed be called violent communication. Now, Mika, before I read what is nonviolent communication, do you agree? Yes, no? What are your thoughts on what I just read?
Yeah, like violent communication is when you're using those approaches to manipulate and cause harm, when I know it could just be a lot of the ways that people communicate using emotional manipulation and kind of coercion and that sort of thing.
Yeah. A lot of people do express their emotions in a way that aren't really mindful of the impact that they're going to have. And these are things that we need to look at more closely and we need to be careful about because it can alienate the people in our lives. Some of the examples that he cites of violent communication merit their own deep dive, but we'll get into that shortly.
Yep.
Now, what is nonviolent communication? Nonviolent communication is the integration of 4 things. Consciousness, a set of principles that support living a life of compassion, collaboration, courage, and authenticity. Language, understanding how words contribute to connection or distance. Communication, knowing how to ask for what we want, how to hear others even in disagreement, and how to move towards solutions that work for all. Means of influence, sharing, quote-unquote, power with others, rather than using, quote-unquote, power over others. All right? Nonviolent communication serves our desire to do 3 things. Increase our ability to live with choice, meaning, and connection. Connect empathically with self and others to have more satisfying relationships. And sharing of resources so everyone is able to benefit. Now, what do you think of that rundown of nonviolent communication, Mika? Yay or nay?
I didn't hear anything that immediately jumped out as, like, incorrect. Like, it all sounds really nice when it's, like, written down that cleanly.
Yeah.
When there's people not involved.
When it doesn't actually involve living, breathing human beings and it's just words on a page, it's like, beautiful. Yeah, I think it's a nice way of illustrating the difference between communication that can cause harm and communication that is meant to bring people closer together.
Yeah.
One word that sticks out from me in that rundown is the word consciousness. I struggle with this word sometimes.
Mm.
Not because I'm unconscious in some way,
Yeah.
but this word has been used in a lot of different communities to mean something quite creepy.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know. Everyone listening is probably like,
Because I
what's
use that.
Leslie on
Because
today?
I use that word a lot, so now I'm curious as to
Oh yeah? Like, in what contexts does the word consciousness come up so frequently for you?
like being conscious of your actions, or
Oh, yes.
yeah, and consciousness of like how it's more like thoughtful, being thoughtful of what you're doing,
Yeah.
because a lot of stuff we do on autopilot.
Yes. Yeah. Precisely. And I think that's a healthy way of looking at consciousness. Coming off of autopilot and being more intentional with how you do things.
Yes, exactly.
And generally not being unconscious.
Yeah.
Being responsive. Someone taps you on the shoulder and you can actually, like, respond to that.
Yeah. I mean, I've gone through a lot of my life unconscious, like just barely there, so it's not that unrealistic.
Yeah. So the thing that sometimes gives me the ick about this word is when it's used to denote some level of superiority over other people. This idea that, like, oh, we know something the rest of you don't because we are awake. We are conscious. We have exited the matrix. There's a lot of that in the, like, deep, like, conspiracy crowd.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah.
I guess I do get kind of frustrated with people who behave in ways that seem so unthoughtful, though, and that may be where I have used it to be like, need to be conscious of your actions, like,
Yeah.
conscious of how you affect others, that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
But I guess that's different to being like, oh, you just don't even know anything.
Yeah. There's the on the ground, practical, like, real world planet Earth level of consciousness that is good for everyone, I think. And then there's the whole hashtag transcendence consciousness
Oh,
that
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
has this, like,
Spiritualness to it as well.
yeah. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with spirituality, being a spiritual person in touch with different kinds of modalities and things like that. But when it leans really heavily into this whole, like, I am completely above all of the problems of earthlings because I can meditate all my pain away, and it's, like, just wrapped up in this, like, toxic positivity, that's when it becomes harmful. Because that's when people create this bubble around themselves where they are just free from the laws of human beings and physics and science because they're conscious.
Yeah.
They're awake. They're not woke. Woke is bad. They're awake. That's better.
I think I also struggle with it from that spiritual perspective, in that it's a strong belief that that is the correct way. And to have a belief that strongly that it's correct means everyone else is incorrect.
Yes.
Whereas I can believe what I'm doing is the more likely path that I think will lead to the right place, but I don't ever close the door to, well, I try not to. I try not to close the door to other people's approaches and try and continue to take that in and see if there is merit in it.
Yeah, and you said something really important there, because that's why I'm going on and on about this in relation to the book. It's that idea that sometimes people have that this is the right way, I've got the right way of doing things.
Yep.
And now I'm going to shine the light of consciousness upon you. That expression is used so many times in this book. Shine the light of consciousness, which just means applying nonviolent communication in situations that severely overestimate its effectiveness in some very, very complex situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think that term was actually used in the abridged version particularly often. If I don't even remember it.
Too many syllables.
We've already noticed quite a few differences in the two copies we have read and listened to. So that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, and that says so much as well about how these things are applied when they're taken so... when they're separated so much from the source material. If even the abridged version of this book erases so many of the problematic facets of the source material, then when people take the methods that are kind of spread throughout the world relating to nonviolent communication, they might apply it in a very useful way, but to then say, just adopt nonviolent communication, it kind of gives this message that, like, it's this unquestionable path to enlightenment. It's like whisper down the alley, right? The message gets changed the more and more it's, like, dissipated. Yeah.
Yes. I think that there's a lot of nuance
Yeah.
that we should address
Yeah.
coming, like, further down and after we've talked about the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, a few things that I want to focus on primarily in this discussion, because as usual, we can't talk about every aspect of it. I want to talk about racial gaslighting.
Yeah, that's the one that really really stands out in this book.
Yeah, I want to talk about systemic oppression, and of course, racial gaslighting kind of comes under that umbrella. And I want to talk about the idea of power imbalances that seems to be just absent from this whole discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm thinking of an example.
Yeah. And before we jump into those bits, like, again, I think this can be a very useful model, and there are elements of it that I use in my everyday life, in my practices, with my clients, with, friends and family.
Yeah.
But in some ways it feels like it's almost like coincidental. Like the communication that I use just happens to be similar to what is outlined in this book because it is meant to empathize. You know what I mean? It's not like, I fancy myself to be a good communicator because I've studied nonviolent communication. It's just like I communicate in a way that is nonviolent. Anyway.
Yeah.
All right, so let's dive in, shall we?
Yes.
All right. Nonviolent communication.
Sorry if I seem like I'm spacing out a bit, because I'm kind of trying to break down, even now, kind of where I find it useful and where it's not, and how I approach it. And so it keeps kind of like chugging over in my head.
Okay, so explain to our listeners what the overall picture, the steps of nonviolent communication are, according to Marshall B. Rosenberg.
Yeah,
Pretty hot dude.
sure. So, step one is observing the situation, your emotions, with a non-judgmental perspective. So trying not to apply meaning to what's happening, just look at the actual what's happening.
Yes.
Because you can just get wrapped up in like the emotion and meaning.
Yeah.
Too much to be able to be objective. Then you should observe your feelings and just like an emotion, not all the thoughts attached to it.
Yeah.
And try and find step 3, the need that's not being met to cause that emotion. So instead of seeing like good emotions and bad emotions, it's more like emotions of needs being met, emotions of needs not being met. And if you're feeling a negative emotion, in inverted commas,
when Mika starts to enunciate like that, we know it's an inverted commas.
Cool.
Negative emotion.
Yes, that's how I do it.
Yeah.
Writing in words. Yeah, when you're feeling one of these difficult emotions, you can look like, what do I feel isn't getting fulfilled in my life or in the situation? And then you can get to step 4, which means you can then very clearly tell the person what it is that you feel is being not met and what you would like them to be able to do as a request, not a demand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think is where one of the sticky bits comes in, is in our society. It's very hard for a direct request to not come across as a demand because of just our language.
Yeah.
So
Language is an imperfect beast.
yeah,
It can't express everything.
like I use a lot of words to try and make things like flower it up so
You've
that
got the best words.
just like you have to tiptoe around words so much,
Yeah.
and it does give a disadvantage to people who don't have the advantage of having lots of descriptive words and ways to tiptoe around it, or social emotional abilities that they might not have developed, or have different brains that don't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really does. Yeah, all communication, like it's a whole skill.
And that's one way in which this nonviolent communication model can be particularly challenging for people who are neurodivergent, people who are marginalized in some other way, people who are subject to systemic oppression, because the people who anyone communicates with, based on their own level of privilege in any particular context, that can really flavor that communique, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yes. And is it the magic cure for all disputes, Mika?
No.
Really? Because this guy seems to think so.
I would love it if everyone was that cooperative. I mean, it would if everyone was on board, but it's like a utopian idea.
Right. Okay, let's talk about black people.
Ah.
Right? Did that intimidate you?
Oh, I'm so scared.
Okay. Yeah, I mentioned in the opening of this chapter, there's a lot of racial gaslighting in this book, and that's one of the areas in which this model comes off as quite flawed. In the wrong hands, it can be really dangerous and extremely dismissive of history and sociology.
Particularly when applied without the flowery tiptoe language.
Yeah. So, and one clear illustration of this is the fact that even looking in the index under R, there's one listing for racial issues, NVC to resolve.
Okay.
And then a bunch of little page range markers, and I'm like, okay, let's see. How is communication going to solve racial issues? Let's see one of his examples, right? Okay. This one actually has to do with policing, so...
My take on the book didn't have a lot of these examples, so I didn't get the same opinion until you showed me what was in the text version.
Yeah, that's I'm the personal development party pooper. It's what I do. I'm like, oh, you like that? Was that nice and helpful? Well, no, I don't do that. When things actually help people, I appreciate that. But it's like, we do still need to look at these things through a critical lens when it's appropriate. So, in the chapter, The Power of Empathy, let's take a gander at this. A Metropolitan Police officer attending a follow-up training in NVC, nonviolent communication, once greeted me with this account. I'm going to try to put a police voice on. No, I won't. I'm sure glad you had us practicing empathy with angry people last time. Just a few days after our session, I went to arrest someone in a public housing project. When I brought him out, my car was surrounded by about 60 people screaming things at me like, "Let him go! He didn't do anything! You police are a bunch of racist pigs!" Although I was skeptical that empathy would help, I didn't have many other options. So I reflected back the feelings that were coming at me. I said things like, "So you don't trust my reasons for arresting this man? You think it has to do with race?" After several minutes of my continuing to reflect their feelings, the group became less hostile. In the end, they opened a path so I could get to my car. Now, all right. Let's assume that this is a true story. Although I struggle to picture this scenario in my mind. You know, this race whisperer in the form of a police officer who's like, "Oh, you don't trust my reasons for arresting this man?" And then all the folks in the housing project, which again is more like coded language for black people.
And remember, this is 1960s and 70s America. I think most of these come from as well.
Possibly, yeah. The version that I'm reading from is the 3rd edition.
Not that it's got much better, but it was like even worse.
Yeah. But a lot of these examples, I mean, they all sound like they're spoken from by the same person. Like the voice, the language is all the same. Mm-hmm. Which weirds me out, because it's like, are these even real people? But anyway, one problem with examples like this, and he does this a lot, he has a lot of examples and a lot of stories, but doesn't dive deeply into the context in which they happen. He kind of poo-poos the idea of context. He's like, nope, it's about the present moment and present data and finding ways to move forward through speaking nicely to each other. Mm-hmm. That example, it just ends there.
Yeah.
Because the next paragraph is, finally, I'd like to illustrate a completely different example. So it's presenting this idea of race being something that generates tension, or racism being something that generates tension, and then saying, "Oh no, but it wasn't racist." And it's like, oh, okay. Never mind the long history of over-policing in communities of color, and how often that happens, and even using expressions like, the group became less hostile.
Yeah.
It feeds into this narrative that, like, you know, people in these public housing projects who just think that the police are there to be racist, they're just hostile. They're just angry black people. And I reflected empathy, and I reflected my needs to them, and they calmed down. Mm-hmm. It's like, that's BS.
And it did actually make me realize just now one of the big steps that's missing from the model that I use, which is to genuinely acknowledge the other person's struggle with empathy.
Yeah.
So when you're in a situation, I first start with, like, what I can see that they're struggling with, or, like, my interpretation of what they've been trying to say through what might not be the best way, or the way I would like to receive that information. Maybe it is anger, whatever. However it's said, I try and say, like, this is what I see you're dealing with. This is because until you have brought that down and kind of said, like, I'm coming down to try and see, like, down, I'm saying, like, down to your level, but, like, emotionally or power-wise, trying to step down power-wise to be equals if you are in the position of power, like a police officer. Like, the cop is just like, well, this is what I want.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like, it's not saying, like, I acknowledge that I'm in this position of power and it's been really unfair and I can see why you would be angry
Yep.
for that reason, and I apologize for that. But this right now, this is what I need to do to do my job.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Yeah. But it also, I mean, it gives Who Moved My Cheese as well. In that it's like, no, it's not about the systems. It's just about your own actions and your choices and your communication and your mindset. It's like, no, there are systems in place that are pretty shit as well.
Yeah.
Here's another example, right? He writes, I was once invited to work with some high school students who suffered a long litany of grievances against their principal. They regarded the principal as racist and searched for ways to get even with him. A minister who worked closely with the young people became deeply concerned over the prospect of violence. Out of respect for the minister, the students agreed to meet with me. You know, he paints himself as this race whisperer, right? Like, he writes later in the book, like, I'm often called to meetings where there are racial tensions, blah, blah. I'm like, why? Why are they asking you, or, you know, back when you were alive, why?
Yeah.
Why were you the go-to guy to be like, hey, give us, like, no. Anyway. I'll keep reading. They began by describing what they saw as discrimination on the part of the principal. After listening to several of their charges, I suggested that they proceed by clarifying what they wanted from the principal. What good would that do? Scoffed one student in disgust. We already went to him to tell him what we wanted. His answer to us was, get out of here. I don't need you people telling me what to do. I asked the students what they had requested of the principal. They recalled saying to him that they didn't want him telling them how to wear their hair. There's a lot of potential depth in that example as well. I suggested that they might have received a more cooperative response if they had expressed what they did rather than what they did not want.
Hey, Leslie.
What?
How would you like people to not touch your hair?
Okay, so that
What
t-shirt...
do you want?
The t-shirt that I wear that says, don't touch my hair, should I reword that into what I do want? Do you keep your fingers out of my hair?
Yeah, it just doesn't work when someone is imposing themselves onto you.
And this is the thing. When you've got this principal calling them you people, first of all, deeply problematic.
Yeah, I was bothered by his apparently the racist, or they believe he's racist, and then he goes ahead and says, like, the principal was doing these super racist things.
Yeah. And one of the requests that they had in here was, we'd like you to refer to us as black students and not you people.
Yeah.
Another request was, we'd like you to agree to black student representation on decisions made about dress code. Okay, so it's like this guy clearly has blind spots that these requests are very reasonable, and there is racism coded within them. Okay?
Yep.
He finishes off that example by saying, the following day, the students presented their requests to the principal using the positive action language we had practiced. That evening, I received an elated phone call from them, all of them, BS. Their principal had agreed to all 38 requests. Now, first of all, I don't think they got in a room and said, hey, let's call up Rosenberg and tell him this great news.
Yeah.
It's like, thank you, our white savior. You taught us how to better communicate with our racist principle. Because again, he doesn't dive into any of the actual things powering the racial tension there. He moves on to the next example. A completely different group of people. A completely different communication scenario.
He seems very disinterested in the actual issue behind the conflicts.
Yeah.
And just resolving that conflict, even if it's like plastering over a crack.
Yeah. It's putting a Band-Aid on a zombie bite.
Yeah.
It's like, and there's so much of that in here. It's like, no, everything can be resolved. A school child. He literally writes that later in the book. Like, I believe that even school children could resolve like the most pressing conflicts of the world if they just applied this model of communication. And it's like, it's a bit more complicated than that, bro.
Yeah.
But never once in all of the examples of racism and concerns about racism in this book, never once does he then turn the lens onto the person perpetuating racist activity and saying, hey, you're the problem. Because in this model, no, we can't judge people. We can't judge people. We can't say that someone's racist. It's like, if they are a racist, then they're a racist.
I feel the principal's reply would have been, I have the need that you respect my authority.
Yeah. You're not meeting my need for white superiority.
I mean,
you people.
If you look at what he said about needs, there is based on this, I think it's from the humanist structure and psychology, where humans all have these base needs, and they're the only needs that are addressed in this. So you can't say, I need you to respect my authority. That's not a base human need. It has to be something like autonomy, safety, shelter, nourishment. So it has quite a limited scope there as well. Like, what is the principal's base human need as someone leading a organization as well? Like, what's his personal need got to do with the situation? And also a group of students. I mean, mostly they're basic human rights, so they do apply. But it just, yeah. It doesn't go into those different structures either.
No. There's a lot of both sidesism here as well. The implication is that both entities, this group of students and this racist principal, they have equal footing here, and they have just as much of a right as empathetic human beings to have their needs addressed and met. Oh, hang on a sec. I'm just doing some PBN stuff.
I mean, in the period he wrote, like, was doing this, it was pretty progressive of him to believe that those students had equal rights.
Yeah.
This was him working through recent integration schools, recently integrated schools.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's super weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you ready for another example?
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of going like backwards in the book here. He writes, let me share a personal incident that taught me the effects of hiding our feelings. Okay. Yeah, this is about like expressing feelings, right? I was teaching a course in NVC to a group of inner city students. Again, coded language. When I walked into the room the first day, the students who had been enjoying a lively conversation with each other became quiet. "Good morning," I greeted. Silence. I felt very uncomfortable, but was afraid to express it. Instead, I proceeded in my most professional manner. "For this class, we will be studying a process of communication that I hope you will find helpful in your relationships at home and with your friends." I continued to present information about NVC, but no one seemed to be listening. One girl, rummaging through her bag, fished out a file and began vigorously filing her nails. Have we not seen this movie a million times?
Yeah, I was like, was this an actual thing that used to happen?
I don't know. Students near the windows glued their faces to the panes as if fascinated by what was going on in the street below. I felt increasingly more uncomfortable, yet continued to say nothing about it. Finally, a student who had certainly more courage than I was demonstrating piped up, "You just hate being with black people, don't you?" This is what this inner city student said to him. I was stunned, yet immediately realized how I had contributed to this student's perception by trying to hide my discomfort. "I am feeling nervous," I admitted, "but not because you are black. My feelings have to do with my not knowing anyone here and wanting to be accepted when I came in the room." My expression of vulnerability had a pronounced effect on the students. They started to ask questions about me, to tell me things about themselves, and to express curiosity about NVC. And again, that's where that story ends. It just ends there. And it's like, okay, fine. Like, it's a useful example of, like, a person who couldn't express his feelings, and it kind of gave off this impression, and then he expressed his feelings in a way that was more open. But bringing up the topic of race to then not actually dive into what powers that perception is irresponsible.
Mm-hmm.
It's irresponsible.
Exactly.
Because again, it contributes to this racial gaslighting that happens where people say, "Oh, no, that thing that happened, that wasn't racist. That was just your perception of the thing." And it's like, no. Racism isn't even, it doesn't exist. You only choose to see racism.
Yeah. And it kind of also leaves a taste in your mouth. Excuse me. It also leaves a kind of idea that these black students always just jump to these conclusions, that they're always reading everything as racist, and that's where the problem comes from.
Yeah. It does not talk about the source of these things at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that also leads very elegantly into another issue around systemic oppression that is handled very irresponsibly in this book, and that is the Israel-Palestine conflict. You know, the way to solve all of that, to actually bring peace to the Middle East, is nonviolent communication, right?
Oh, yeah. Like
a school child could do this.
Yep. Of
Yeah.
course. And that's why he solved it back in the 1970s or whatever.
Yeah, it's like, if people would just listen to me and communicate better, then there wouldn't be a genocide. He doesn't use the word genocide, of course.
But they did listen to him in his book. And apparently it didn't work.
Right. So, on page 53, he... Sorry, I have to interrupt myself for a second because I just noticed again that this example comes after another example where he was asked to mediate between landowners and migrant farm workers in Southern California. And he said their conflicts had grown increasingly hostile and violent. I began the meeting by asking these two questions. What is it that you are each needing, and what would you like to request of the other in relation to these needs? The problem is that these people are racist, shouted a farm worker. The problem is that these people don't respect law and order. Law and order, that is a loaded expression, shouted a landowner even more loudly. As is often the case, these groups were more skilled in analyzing the perceived wrongness of others than in clearly expressing their own needs. And then we jump immediately, no deep dive into the nuance or the cultural context of this, immediately into Israel-Palestine, where he writes, in a comparable situation...
Okay.
I once met with a group of Israelis and Palestinians who wanted to establish the mutual trust necessary to bring peace to their homelands. Why were they calling on this guy for that? Like, I need to understand, like, did this even happen? But anyway, I opened this session with the same questions. What is it that you are needing, and what would you like to request from one another in relation to those needs? Instead of directly stating his needs, a Palestinian Mukhtar, who is like a village mayor, answered, "You people are acting like a bunch of Nazis." This is a very timely discussion. You know.
Pity he's not alive to see it.
Yeah, I know. I would have some questions for Mr. Rosenberg. A statement like that is not likely to get the cooperation of a group of Israelis! Exclamation point. Almost immediately, an Israeli woman jumped up and countered, "Mukhtar, that was a totally insensitive thing for you to say." Okay. Here were people who had come together to build trust and harmony. But after only one interchange, matters were worse than before they began. This happens often when people are used to analyzing and blaming one another rather than clearly expressing what they need. But is that really the problem here? It's like that, if we're just looking at the surface, the communication issues, sure. But again, there is a much deeper historical context for what powers these conversations.
Yeah, if they're not going to acknowledge each other's experiences.
Yeah, you can't trust that everyone's acting in good faith. If you just pretend that the only thing that matters is what is happening in this room right now.
Yeah.
All right, he continues. In this case, the woman could have responded to the Mukhtar in terms of her own needs and requests by saying, for example, "I am needing more respect in our dialogue. Instead of telling us how you think we are acting, would you tell us what it is we are doing that you find disturbing?" It has been my experience over and over again that from the moment people begin talking about what they need rather than what's wrong with one another, the possibility of finding ways to meet everybody's needs is greatly increased. Do you think he goes any deeper into like what was powering that conversation?
No.
No, you are correct.
In fact, in the book I read, he didn't even name them as Palestinian and Israeli. He watered it down and just used generic terms, but I could read through.
He didn't call them "you people," did he?
No, but I could read through the context.
Yeah. Today, I think the answer to, "Would you tell us what it is we are doing that you find disturbing?" The response now with what's happening in Palestine would be, stop committing genocide? I mean, like, how about
But they don't believe they're committing.
actions?
They don't believe they're committing genocide.
Yeah,
So
yeah. It's like, end the actions that have killed and displaced 90% of the Palestinian population. Like, and I mean, you can't get into all of it without getting really frustrated.
just for some, because he solved this whole solution, that refugee camp that was established in 1949, and he must have been there in the mid 70s, 80s, something. It now, in 2017, had 8,805 people still living there. Solved.
Yeah, there are powerful forces driving these conflicts. And it can't be fixed with niceties. Like, the people that he's talking about aren't Benjamin Netanyahu and the leader of Hamas. You know? And even so, it's like, when you've got a military that is being bolstered by the world's most powerful militaries against a military that will never, ever have the kind of firepower that is being supplied to this country that has subjected the Palestinian people to a disturbing apartheid and ethnic cleansing for generations.
Yep.
You know, I mean, even in more modern times, going back to the Nakba, 1948, which was really where, I guess I don't know where you draw the line between modern times and before times, but this is an ongoing struggle that the Palestinian people have had since, like, the establishment of the Israeli state, right? But we can't just act like both sides have the same level of power and that both sides are equally complicit in the violence that is happening in that region. It is not okay to do that because it perpetuates this lie that, like, Israel has a right to defend itself by claiming everything in Gaza is Hamas and therefore should be destroyed. Like, no.
Well, also look at the pattern. Every time they pushed back and said, like, well, we need this and you move back, that wasn't it. They came again and were like, no, that's ours as well.
Yeah.
And that's ours as well. So,
yeah. And this is a situation where, like, a tremendous act of violence at a systemic level was very visibly and verifiably inflicted upon a nation of people. And any form of retaliation on their part was seen as a declaration of war that was like, oh, you fought back, now we need to destroy you.
well, yes, because the Israelis doing stuff is law and order, and them doing stuff is a declaration of war.
Yes. And this is very heavily racially coded as well. But before this whole episode turns into like a
Solving the Middle East
try
crisis.
to bring I want to talk a little bit about the idea of violence versus nonviolence, using the examples of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Because these struggles are related.
Yes.
Right? And this is something that I saw so much of when the Black Lives Matter uprisings were happening in 2020. This idea that people taking to the streets and actually, like, fighting in ways that made a lot of people uncomfortable, because it's like, oh, no. You're making us sad by, you know, causing damage to property and this and that, which is like a whole other conversation about how to actually best be disruptive in a way that doesn't upset people too much. I don't even know how to frame that.
I would be on board if you weren't making, like, my life harder, you know?
Yeah, it's like, can't you protest quietly? It's like, do you know how activism works?
You're making me late for work, and now so I have to take the other side.
Yeah, like, you can't stop traffic, guys. It's like, oh, it really grinded my gears when people looked at what was happening in these protests as some form of justification for fighting against Black people.
Yeah.
Essentially, and Black people's allies. It's like, well, if they wouldn't act that way, we wouldn't be so aggressive. If they wouldn't be so aggressive, then we would be nicer to them. Because, and this was clearly illustrated in the way that so many of the memes going around during that time on social media were these images of Martin Luther King Jr. arm in arm with all of these other people dressed in their Sunday best, walking across the bridges and the whatnot.
Yeah.
This is Leslie on Black History in the U.S. with the text over it saying, this is what a protest should look like. And every time I saw these freaking images come up on my socials, I had to, well, most of the time, I had to jump in the comments and remind the people who were posting these things that he got killed too.
Mm-hmm.
He was assassinated as well.
Yep.
So this idea that, like, no, you just have to be nicer. Just use less violent language. It has to just be civil disobedience, and anything else is unacceptable because it makes us sad. And that's where a lot of people, even today, looked at, like, Martin Luther King against someone like Malcolm X, who was very much a by any means necessary person, and had a lot of critiques for Dr. King's tactics of, like, nonviolent resistance, even though they did overlap a lot in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
They're still seen as two very different forces in the civil rights movement.
Yeah. Martin Luther King had very much that non-violent ethics, where he was kind of like a pacifist to, like, he wouldn't raise a hand against someone else, even if they were trying to harm him. Which I don't know if I really agree with pacifism in that sense. Like, I will use non-violence as far as I can, but if you keep threatening my well-being, I'm going to have to fight back. I'm not going to let myself die just because you don't want me to live.
Yeah, exactly.
And I especially like that period, the 1950s and 60s, and you look at the history of how compliant black people were in America, like bending over backwards, wearing their hair in white styles just to appease the white dress codes, and being so very like quiet just so that you could have any chance of having a life, so that you could raise in the ranks at work, or have a house in the suburbs without people chasing you out with pitchforks, and they still did.
Yes.
And they did this for generations of trying to be so compliant and so integrated, and still it wasn't good enough.
Yeah. And to this day, it's still an ongoing battle. I experience it myself on a regular basis.
Yeah.
As black people, as ethnic minorities, who are so easily plunked into the category of, like, angry black woman, in my case, the minute you're seen to fly off the handle, so to speak, there is a sense of forced ambassadorship that every time you're walking down the street, you are representing your race.
Yeah.
You're representing your community. And if you do one thing wrong, you're making the rest of them, those people, look bad. And it's exhausting. So when people get all up in arms saying, like, oh, racism isn't a thing, you're just choosing to see it. It's like, no. If your image of racism is only as extreme as, like, people getting curb stomped left and right just because of the color of their skin, then you've got a twisted idea of what racism actually is.
Yeah. I was just thinking while you're saying that too, trans women are not allowed to ever be angry or upset, because then, oh, look, a man in a dress being aggressive.
Yeah.
And I guess it's the plight of minorities in general that for every if one minority does something wrong, that's all minorities. But if someone in the majority does something wrong, like, oh, they were misunderstood or they had mental
It's a
challenges.
fall from grace. They had affluenza. Poor thing. He grew up too rich.
It's actually a line in a song that I like about that. I should find it.
Yeah. There's a whole different way that people are looked at based on their cultural backgrounds. That means a lot of these nonviolent communication approaches will not land the same way as they would for another person using those situations. And when I think about Black Lives Matter, again, so many people were like angry at what they were seeing happening at some of the more robust uprisings, and getting angry over our anger. And it's like, hey, we have for generations have been trying to get through to everyone else, to you people,
Yeah.
what our needs are. And we've been told for generations that our needs simply don't matter as much as the needs of the white majority.
Yeah.
What matters more is their comfort.
That, and the big mistake that so often I see in conflicts is where people conflate their wants with someone else's needs. Like, they're not dropping that need down to its base human instinct. Like, we both need shelter, but I live in a 4-bedroom house as a single person, and you can't have any house. It's that the answer isn't that we should all have a 2-bedroom house. The answer is, well, too bad, too sad. Like, how dare you suggest that I should have to minimize my lifestyle?
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I love my privilege too much to grant you any sense of humanity. It's like, it's not a vibe, Mika.
It's kind of why I've been starting with, excuse me, a lot of how to say, privileged people that I'm having discussions with, that the first step to any sort of equality is that those with more are going to need to accept that we are going to have less. We can't keep everything and share it. And so until you can wrap your head around the fact that maybe we don't all deserve to keep everything that we just happen to have, it's gonna be a pretty hard discussion to have.
Yeah, and I think it's hard for people to not be threatened by that notion, because it's like, no, but I've worked so hard for everything I have. It's like, well, let's consider, even if we're just for sake of argument talking from a purely material level, like the things that you have in your house. It's like, off of whose backs were those things manufactured? You know, let's think about that. Like, the clothes in your closet. Off of whose backs were those things created so that you could have them at, reasonable prices?
Even the things I've sewn myself, I couldn't have done without the fabric made by someone in a bad situation.
Yeah. I think it's really convenient to deny the level of exploitation that is often necessary for people to enjoy the privileges that they feel that they've earned. And then that's not to say that people don't have a right to enjoy the privilege that they have. I'm not saying that at all. There are privileges that I have that I do enjoy. And I recognize that I am very privileged in some contexts.
Yep.
Underprivileged in other contexts. Context matters. But what I'm saying...
Did you just say you're a whole person and not just a two-dimensional stereotype? How dare you?
I know. How dare I? these levels of exploitation, generationally, the people who have been oppressed under those systems, don't deserve that oppression because, well, they just should have communicated their needs better. Which may seem like a bit of an exaggeration here, but the way he paints the power of nonviolent communication becomes even more absurd in examples like this one. Using empathy to diffuse danger. All right. Content warning for mention of sexual violence. All right. So right away, right? He writes, the ability to offer empathy to people in stressful situations can defuse potential violence. A teacher in the inner city of St. Louis, again, inner city, coded for ethnic minorities, black and brown people, related an incident where she had conscientiously stayed after school to help a student even though teachers were warned for their own safety to leave the building after classes were dismissed. A stranger entered her classroom where the following exchange took place. Young man says, "Take off your clothes." The teacher, noticing that the young man was shaking, "I'm sensing this is very scary for you." The young man, "Did you hear me? God damn it, take off your clothes." The teacher says, "I'm sensing you're really pissed off right now and you want me to do what you're telling me." The young man says, "You're damned right, and you're going to get hurt if you don't." The teacher says, "I'd like you to tell me if there's some other way of meeting your needs that wouldn't hurt me." The young man says, "I said take them off." The teacher says, "I can hear how much you want this. At the same time, I want you to know how scared and horrible I feel and how grateful I'd be if you'd leave without hurting me." The young man says, "Give me your purse." The teacher handed the stranger her purse, relieved not to be raped. She later described how each time she empathized with the young man, she could sense him becoming less adamant in his intention to follow through with the rape. Do you think he explored that example in any meaningful way following that, Mika?
No.
No. He jumps to the next example, which was the one that I gave earlier about the police officer and the people who were calling him racist. He just skipped from that to the next thing.
It does always seem to be stories about black aggressors.
There are a number of them here, or people in the inner city, right? But what I found so disturbing about that example is you are saying that the thing that saved this teacher from being raped was her ability to empathize with her would-be attacker. You are actually saying, right before this, he said, I'll read that first sentence again. The ability to offer empathy to people in stressful situations can defuse potential violence. Again, I'm not cherry picking here. This is all he said about this incident. That was all of it. If you can just use nonviolent communication against someone who wants to violate you sexually, then your empathy can save you from this attack. It's come on, dude. Come on. I'm not saying it can never happen. I'm not saying that at all. There are cases where people might be held at gunpoint or something, and empathy can get them out of that situation. But the way he's writing it doesn't allow for the possibility that nonviolent communication isn't the number one way to get yourself out of these problems.
Yeah, I think it would more be a de-escalation method, which you use for safety.
Yeah.
And it's more to do with just you're not truly empathizing with the person at the time. You're using generalizations, or like maybe you could call it empathy, to think about why they might be acting the way they are. Because if you make them feel seen and heard, it might help them to... It reduces the chances they're going to hurt you. If you humanize them, they will start to see you as a human, and it makes it harder for them to commit violence against you.
Yes. Yes.
But it's a tool for it's coercion, manipulation for the sake of a good outcome. You're not doing it out of a true desire for communication and a good relationship.
Yeah. Which, again, doesn't mean that it's not worth doing.
Yeah, it's just not a good place to present it.
Yes.
Like, that's a whole different book.
Yeah, yeah. But I think if we're bringing all of this together to sort of start bringing it to a close, the major takeaway here is that we need to be aware of how we are presenting any kind of method of communication, any kind of personal development tool, any kind of anything, how we are presenting it as, like, are we properly representing the tools that we're using? Like, are we giving them too much power to solve all of the problems of the world without considering who is actually using these tools?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because when we do that, that can be really dangerous. You have to consider that in order for nonviolent communication to work, people have to be willing to come to the table. It assumes, the way it's written in this book, assumes that people are going to be using this in good faith.
Yes.
And not as a manipulation tool. And not as a way to gaslight people. And not as a way to just be really passive-aggressive.
To minimize people's experiences.
Yeah. And it's not going to work the same way if the person you're trying to communicate is, like, a narcissist, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Or has some other issue that's going to potentially make things worse.
Or if you're trying to change that person with this method, like...
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to be careful with how this is being used and by whom it's being used.
Exactly. And that actually brings up something I wanted to mention, is the different, like, philosophies / theology of nonviolence. And so I think the perspective that he's trying to imply but doesn't necessarily work with a lot of the examples he's given is principled nonviolence, which often comes from theology, but also some...
Wait, principle, is this that racist principle who calls us you people?
As in coming from a place of principle ethics.
Okay.
So it could be your religious beliefs, or it could be just a philosophical belief that you have come to, where you would say it's a rejection of all violence and coercion. So that's both physical violence and emotional violence.
Yeah.
And it's seeking a solution where all parties win, not seeking to get your own way, to win a conflict.
Yeah.
And some of these nonviolence theories come from certain religious and philosophical backgrounds that believe that suffering is part of it. Like, you are going to suffer and everyone's going to suffer certain things. And it's almost like a bit of a... It's where I kind of jump off the wagon, where I'm trying to minimize suffering in general.
I'm picturing you literally jumping off of an actual wagon, by the way.
Hell yeah.
Just to let you know.
Yeah.
I'm dreaming
Stop.
about you.
Duck and roll.
Duck and cover.
Or straight onto a horse, one of the horses, and just take off.
Oh, yeah.
And then you've got your like pragmatic nonviolence, which is where I think a lot of those examples start looking like kind of the Palestine Israel stuff, where it's like, or the police officer, or even the woman like trying not to get raped. Like, it's pragmatic. It's trying to use these techniques to negotiate a way to the outcome you want.
Yeah.
Not a mutual... Like, with a rapist, like, what are you really trying to get a mutual outcome from? Like, oh, I'll consensually have sex with you if that makes it a mutual, midpoint.
That is dark, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, you can't...
Here, have my purse instead.
Oh. So, pragmatic violence, I would say, is coercive, and it's still a battle where you're trying to win your side. You're not looking necessarily for a mutual outcome. It's about not getting hurt or getting what you want. And so it can be a positive thing, as we just said, in getting out of a sticky situation.
Yeah.
But it also can be used and we see it all the time in politics. And in fact, it's now kind of the standard approach to politics, is this non-violent communication techniques, but used in a coercive manner.
Yeah.
Because, like, principled non-violence can still have persuasion, where you're trying to persuade someone, but only before it becomes coercion. You're trying to show people the evidence and the ideas and wanting them to agree, but only if they want to agree. Not forced.
Yeah.
And there's also an important part, which we can't get into today, but like non-violence versus harmlessness versus passivity. Those are all different as well. You can be non-violent but still able to defend yourself and put your foot down if they've crossed the boundary of the non-violence.
Yeah.
But that's, harmlessness is like, oh, I'm not doing anything, not going to raise a hand. And passivity, where you're just like, it's not actually non-violence, you're just sitting back and not doing anything, which is what a lot of people consider. They're like, oh, you're marching down the street and yelling that you deserve rights. How dare you? That scares me, because like what I'm doing is non-violence, which is being happy with the status quo.
Yeah.
And just letting it exist because I'm fine with how it is.
Because I'm shining the light of consciousness onto the situation. And he does kind of touch on that very thing in a way that's very dismissive of protesting and things like that. Yeah. But again, like, it's just scratching the surface on a very interesting issue. But also, I'd like to reiterate, again, there are things within this model that are very useful, especially the things around clearly communicating your needs to someone. You just have to be careful about how you do it. Or as a counselor, a coach, a therapist of any sort, not pushing it as like the be-all end-all solution for any dispute or any mediation. Because he literally writes in this book, in the chapter about mediation, that this is like the best and only like method that's gonna work. I'm badly paraphrasing. And even when I think back to like previous emotionally abusive relationships that I've been in. I mean, like, my most recent one before I met Tony is a perfect example of it, and we'll save that for a footnote. But it's a perfect example of how people use nonviolent communication as a way of trying to appear to be the more, like, logical, more sensible person in any dispute. And it's like, oh, you're acting up. You're acting from a place of emotion. That is inferior to how I'm being. Look at yourself. Look at how you're behaving. Look at your body language. You've already lost this argument because you've responded emotionally. It's like, shut up. It's like, well, when you're mentally, emotionally torturing someone for years, and then, we'll save it for a footnote.
Yeah. But hey, I did find those lyrics that I wanted to share. Let me read them for you.
Okay. Where are they from?
The rapper's name is Dave. He's from the UK. And this song is called Black. And it's a great song. Listen to it. But I'll just read this little bit. The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. Kid dies, the blacker the killer, the sweeter the news. And if he's white, you give him a chance, he's ill and confused. If he's black, he's probably armed. You see him shoot. Look.
Oh, God, that resonates.
Yeah. It's a song about the experience of being a black person in this world.
Yes, thank you for sharing that with us as a white man from Australia.
Yes, well,
yes.
I am just sharing Dave's amazing song.
Yes, thank you.
And it just, when it was one of the conversations we had about that.
But it's important because, I mean, I consider you a really good, solid ally who is, like, continuously working on continuing your journey, or continuously working towards anti-racism. And by seeking out and sharing resources like that, that's part of the process. So one thing that I'm going to
I do try, and I hope to be called out if I ever step over the the line.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
Be like, Mika, stop calling me you people. Stop touching my hair. The safe word is, Mika, stop touching me. No, but in the show notes, I think I've previously linked my first big Black Lives Matter speech in a previous episode, but I'm going to link it again in the show notes for this one, as well as the 4th of July one that I did in 2020, because that specifically calls out some of this, like, black victim versus white perpetrator power imbalance thing and how that's perceived by people.
Yes.
Anyway, what a conversation, hey?
Yeah. I have to say, literally the first line of the book had me set up expecting what came.
What do you mean, Mika?
Literally the first line on the audiobook was, oh, when I was young and the race riots and we were so scared and had to stay inside for our own safety. I was like, oh, is this all the black? And I'm like, nope. Okay. Uh-oh.
I, as a white person, had to hide from the inner city natives.
Yeah, that's what it felt like.
Yeah. I tell you what, all this talk of nonviolent communication and it being upholded as, like, the only way to get anything done makes me want to spend the rest of the day just, like, swearing at people in the street. just for a bit of catharsis. You're like, hey, everyone, F off. It's Australia. That's what they do here, right?
You
Yeah, even people we like, we just swear at them.
Yeah, that's a pet name over here.
Yeah.
You adorable little
Yeah. Culture, hey?
You're going to have to bleep. Like, I know in America that's like, you cannot even whisper. I'm sorry
right.
to all the American listeners.
That's all right. All right. So we've got a quote to round off this discussion. And guess who this one is from? I almost called you darling. I'm gonna do it. Okay. Guess who this one is from, darling?
Martin Luther King?
Close. The other black person in history.
Oh, Malcolm X.
Malcolm X.
Okay, yeah.
Yes. All right. I've got a couple from Brother Malcolm, actually.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Here's one to start with. I don't even call it violence when it's in self-defense. I call it intelligence. That's one to think about. All right. Number two. Concerning nonviolence. It is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, number 3. I don't favor violence. If we could bring about recognition and respect of our people by peaceful means, well and good. Everybody would like to reach his objectives peacefully. But I'm also a realist. The only people in this country who are asked to be nonviolent are black people.
Because the only violence that counts is the visible, like, reported on, filmed. None of the institutional type.
Yeah, and in this context, I think you can interchange the expression black people with other marginalized groups as well.
Mm-hmm. I just want to reply with this quote from George Orwell.
Yeah.
Those who abjure violence can do so only because others are committing violence on their behalf. Please.
Colonization!
Law and order.
Oof. Yeah. Law and order. Loaded. Where can people find us, Mika?
That was meant to be my line, wasn't it?
Sorry, I just had to blurt it out.
Yeah. You can find us on Leslie's website, which is leslievcoaching.com.
Yes.
And on Leslie's Instagram.
Yes.
Leslie V Coaching.
You're learning so quickly.
Yeah, just like a year or something.
Nice. Yeah. So, and remember, that's Leslie with an IE, none of this EY BS. Like, who even invented that? No offense. And I'm glad we could finally get another episode out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're both been...
It's been quite a year, especially this month. It's gone by so quickly. Anyway, stay tuned for our next chapter. We'll see you then.
See ya.
Bye.